science delusion is the belief that science already understands the nature of reality in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in. This is a very widespread belief in our society. It's the kind of belief system of people who say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. It's a belief system which has now been spread to the entire world. But there's a conflict in the heart of science between science as a method of inquiry based on reason, evidence, hypothesis, and collective investigation, and science as a belief system or a worldview. And unfortunately, the worldview aspect of science has come to inhibit and constrict the free inquiry, which is the very lifeblood of the scientific endeavor. Since the late 19th century, science has been conducted under the aspect of a belief system or worldview, which is essentially that of materialism, philosophical materialism. And the sciences are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the materialist worldview. I think that as we break out of it, the sciences will be regenerated. What I do in my book, The Science Delusion, which is called Science Set Free in the United States, is take the 10 dogmas or assumptions of science and turn them into questions, seeing how well they stand up if you look at them scientifically. None of them stand up very well. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. But I want to spend a few moments on the constants of nature too, because these are again assumed to be constant. Things like the gravitational constant, the speed of light, are called the fundamental constants. Are they really constant? I was very intrigued by this, and I couldn't make sense of it. So I went to see the head of metrology at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. Metrology is the science in which people measure constants. And I asked him about this. I said, what do you make of this drop in the speed of light between 1928 and 1945? And he said, oh dear, he said, you've uncovered the most embarrassing episode in the history of our science. So I said, well, could the speed of light have actually dropped? And that would have amazing implications if so. He said, no, of course it couldn't have actually dropped. It's a constant. So, well then how do you explain the fact everyone was finding it going much slower during that period? Is it because they were fudging their results to get what they thought other people should be getting, and the whole thing was just produced in the minds of physicists? We don't like to use the word fudge. I said, well, what do you prefer? He said, well, we prefer to call it intellectual phase locking. So I said, well, if it was going on then, how can we be so sure it's not going on today? And that the present values are produced by intellectual phase locking. And he said, oh, we know that's not the case. I said, how do we know? He said, we've solved the problem. And I said, well, how? He said, well, we fixed the speed of light by definition in 1972. So I said, but it might still change. He said, yes, but we'd never know it because we've defined the meter in terms of the speed of light. So the units had changed with it. So he looked very pleased about that. They'd fixed that problem. But I said, well, then what about big G, the gravitational constant known in the trade as big G? It's written with a capital G, Newton's universal gravitational constant. That's varied by more than 1.3% in recent years. And it seems to vary from place to place and from time to time. And he said, oh, well, those are just errors. And unfortunately, there are quite big errors with big G. So I said, well, what if it's really changing? I mean, perhaps it is really changing. And then I looked at how they do it. What happens is they measure it in different labs. They get different values on different days, and then they average them. And then other labs around the world do the same, and they come out usually with a rather different average. And then the International Committee on Metrology meets every 10 years or so and average the ones from labs around the world to come up with the value of big G. But what if G were actually fluctuating? What if it changed? There's already evidence, actually, that it changes throughout the day and throughout the year. What if the Earth, as it moves through the galactic environment, went through patches of dark matter or other environmental factors that could alter it? Maybe they all change together. What if these errors are going up together and down together? For more than 10 years, I've been trying to persuade metrologists to look at the raw data. In fact, I'm now trying to persuade them to put it online on the internet with the dates and the actual measurements and see if they're correlated, to see if they're all up at one time, all down at another. If so, they might be fluctuating together, and that would tell us something very, very interesting. But no one has done this. They haven't done it because G's are constant. There's no point looking for changes. You see, here's a very simple example of where a dogmatic assumption actually inhibits inquiry. I myself think that the constants may vary quite considerably, well, within narrow limits, but they may all be varying. And I think the day will come when scientific journals like Nature have a weekly report on the constants, like stock market reports in newspapers. You know, this week, big G was slightly up, the charge on the electron was down, the speed of light held steady, and so on. That's one area, just one area where I think thinking less dogmatically could open things up. I don't have time to deal with any more of these dogmas, but every single one of them is questionable. If one questions it, new forms of research, new possibilities open up. And I think as we question these dogmas that have held back science so long, science will undergo a reflowering, a renaissance. I'm a total believer in the importance of science. I've spent my whole life as a research scientist, my whole career. But I think by moving beyond these dogmas, it can be regenerated. Once again, it can become interesting and, I hope, life-affirming. Thank you.
In the real world, there's no such thing as infinity. Therefore, there is a fundamental flaw in the formulation of Einstein's theory.
I think the most embarrassing problem we have in theoretical physics is that we have these two different theories which won't talk to each other. We have Einstein's theory of gravity, which beautifully describes the very big and the very fast. And then we have quantum physics, which very successfully describes the very small. And yet, clearly nature has one unique way of operating. It's not schizophrenic, and we humans just don't seem to be able to find that way.
When physicists tried to combine the two theories, they encountered a familiar problem.
I insert this into the probability that gravity will move from one point to another point. When I actually do this calculation, I get yet another integral. And when you do this integral, you get something which makes no sense whatsoever. An infinity. Total nonsense. In fact, you get an infinite sequence of infinities, infinitely worse than the divergences of Einstein's original theory. This is a nightmare beyond comprehension.
The search for a theory of quantum gravity had fallen apart because quantum mechanics and general relativity proved to be totally incompatible.
The equations no longer make any sense. And nobody knows exactly what we're supposed to do about that.
Well, it's awful. It means that physics is having a nervous breakdown. It means the collapse of physics as we know it. You know, something is fundamentally wrong. Nature is smarter than we are.
If we want to understand the universe, we must understand how quantum mechanics and gravity can live together. And so that's our challenge.
So it's quite a big question.
It's a huge question. There aren't questions much bigger than this. We know what a singularity is. A singularity is when we don't know what to do.
Total nonsense.
There's no inside structure.
Is it hollow?
Yeah, there's only a surface. There's nothing inside.
Is the sun actually, do you believe, combusting in and out
It's
itself?
not burning anything. There's no fusion in the sun. That's well understood.
Prove it.
Yeah, well, there's just not the way to prove that there is any. It's only in the flares that you get fusion. That's why all the X-rays. The flares, the arcs, and the X-rays, and the microwaves, and whatever result of fusion in the arcs. There's no fusion in the sun. They don't know how the sun works.
Why do you, what's special, how does the sun make light?
It's a transformer. Transforms from some other dimension. It's not burning anything. It doesn't have to. It's a converter.
Of what?
I don't know. Nobody knows. But that's what it does. That's the only thing it can do, because that's how everything works.
It's transforming from another dimension.
Yeah, you could say it's taking energy from another dimension, counter space. There's no energy, actually. You can't, most of it you can't even measure in outer space or see.
Can't see.
No, you can't see the sun in free space.
So the sun is not visible in outer space.
Not in free space. It's only invisible when gross matter becomes involved, like the Earth's atmosphere and envelope and the surface of the moon or whatever. That makes the light. Otherwise, there is no light. You can see the moon, you can see the Earth, but you can't see the sun or you can't see the stars.
But you can see the planets and the satellite.
Right. You can see material objects, but you cannot see the sources of light. There is no light until there's a material object.
To reflect on.
So that means there's no time delay. So the whole time delay thing is meaningless. It doesn't take light years. There are no light years because there's no light. So that means that the light you see from the distant stars isn't 4 million years old. It could be only minutes old. It could be instantaneous. All the theories collapse when you can't see the stars in outer space.
In the beginning, there was nothing, an infinite void. Then, in an instant, everything known to man came into being. The Big Bang, the birth of time itself, chaos and beauty. A beauty that created infinite galaxies. Galaxies that would one day create the unimaginable. Life, but even more incredible. The human brain. The pinnacle of billions of years of evolution. A brain that possesses the power of reason and the ability to ponder life's most dangerous.
To Professor Dawkins, how do you explain the origin of the laws of physics?
I do not know the origin of the laws of physics, as I've said again and again.
Can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Can we just stop one? I think.
Humans, for the most part, don't have a clue. They don't want one or need one either. They're happy. They think they have a good bead on things.
But why the big secret? People are smart. They can handle it.
The person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it. 1,500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was flat, and 15 minutes ago, you knew that people were alone on this planet. Imagine what you'll know tomorrow.
We believe, though we cannot yet prove, that our multiverse of universes is 11-dimensional. So think of this 11-dimensional arena. And in this arena, there are bubbles that float. And the skin of the bubble represents an entire universe. So we're like flies trapped on flypaper. We're on the skin of a bubble. It's a 3-dimensional bubble. The 3-dimensional bubble is expanding, and that's called the Big Bang Theory.
Our universe is just a small random accident in a vast multiverse, and it's fascinating because it means as each universe sort of pops out, falls out of inflation, it can fall out in a different way. It's like falling down a mountain. You can fall in lots of different directions. And each different direction that you leave inflation, in some sense, could give different laws of physics in that region of space, or at least certain different laws of physics. And if that's the case, it may be that many of the fundamental laws that we see and think are truly fundamental are just accidents of our experience. It could be in each universe there are different laws of physics, and that may help explain other paradoxes about the universe we see.
So we're nothing but a soap bubble floating in a bubble bath of soap bubbles. And so in some sense, the multiverse can be likened to a bubble bath. Our universe is nothing but one bubble, but there are other bubbles. When two bubbles collide, that could merge into a bigger bubble, which could be the Big Bang. In fact, that's what probably the Big Bang is. Or perhaps a bubble fissioned in half and split off into two bubbles. That could be the Big Bang.
Some people get upset that we change the meaning of nothing.
Or perhaps the universe popped into existence out of nothing. That is also a possibility.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how it started. We know the kind of event that it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, and how did that happen?
I told you we don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
No, nor has anyone.
Nor has anyone else.
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Because there are laws, such as gravity, the universe can, and will, create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. It is why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touched paper and set the universe going.
And space-time was created by the Big Bang. Thus, time didn't exist before the Big Bang, so it doesn't make much sense to ask what happened before it. There was no then. Of course, this, like many ideas in cosmology, doesn't really make any sense to our puny human brains. It's largely beyond our comprehension.
So you want to find the farthest point from that center. And it turns out sea level at the equator is farther away from the center of the Earth than sea level near the pole. It has nothing to do with global warming and melting of the ice caps.
Why is that?
Because Earth, we know it spins once a day, yes. 3 people know that the day last Earth.
Good for row number 2. They're off to a great start.
So you spin, when you spin pizza dough, it kind of flattens out. It gets wider in the middle. So Earth, throughout its life, even when it formed, it was spinning. And it got a little wider at the equator than it does at the pole. So it's not actually a sphere. It's oblate. Officially, it's an oblate sphere. That's what we call it. But not only that, it's slightly wider below the equator than above the equator.
A little chubbier.
A little chubbier.
Yeah.
Chubby's a good word. It's like pear-shaped. So it turns out the pear-shapedness is bigger than the height of Mount Everest above sea level.